What's up guys, my name is Ace, and today we got the long-awaited white paper for the skill portion of matchmaking in Call of Duty, where they go through and explain how skill is factored into the matchmaking equation. And we've been waiting for this one for quite some time. They were a little later than expected on this. And in today's video, I wanted to go through at least some of the highlights, some of the main points that I pulled out of this, some interesting points that were clarifying things that were up in the air and we were confused about, some other things that I consider to be sort of red flags, or at least I have an issue with. And then I just wanted to talk about my overall thoughts on this. Now, a few things to keep in mind. First off, I'm not going to go through this entire paper line by line and read out the entire thing for you guys, simply because that would be a very boring video, that would be a very long video, and I don't think it's really necessary to go through absolutely every detail. But if you are interested in all the details, of course, I will leave the paper linked down below. And then on top of that, I think it's important to state my biases where I stand when it comes to the matchmaking system in Call of Duty. I have been a vocal critic of this matchmaking system since Modern Warfare 2019. I really don't like what it's done, but I also acknowledge that I am in the higher percentage of public match players. I'm not claiming to be the best player in the game or anything, but yes, I would be considered in the higher percentile of players that are negatively affected by this the most. So that will absolutely skew my perception of this. And one more thing to clarify here, something that I've always said, and some people misquote me on this, I am not completely against all forms of SBMM in public matches. I think some level of SBMM is totally fine, if not necessary, for the long-term health of a game and a franchise. And with older Call of Duty games, like before Modern Warfare 2019, there was skill-based matchmaking present, and I was totally fine with that level of SBMM. Whatever they were doing in the past was fine by me. It's the modern matchmaking system that I have big issues with. And with that out of the way, let's dive into this and just start going through the main points that I wanted to pull out. And the first thing they mentioned here was a list of 5 properties that they aim for when determining a player's skill level. And number 1 is that skill value should be constrained between 2 numbers. So there should be a high point and a low point, and skill should be defined somewhere between those 2 points. Number 2 is it should be highly predictive. So they want it to be a reliable predictor of your future performance. Number 3, it should be summable such that the average skill of multiple players is predictive of their combined skill. And this is tied in with the team balancing system, which we'll look at in greater detail later on. Number 4 is one that I have the biggest issue with out of these 5, and that is it should be capable of adapting to a player's ever-changing performance quickly. And again, we'll dive into some more detail with that one in a little bit. And then number 5, it should be resilient, so the overall skill distribution should remain accurate in all situations. Like if there's an influx of fresh players, for instance, it shouldn't completely throw the system off. So that gives a bit of an insight as to the goals that they have with their skill calculation. Next, they have a little section about how skill is calculated. And a couple points I wanted to pull out of this is, first off, your hidden skill rating that the matchmaking system uses that you never get to see is adjusted after every single match that you play. And they have confirmed that the value of your skill adjustment will be inversely proportional to the likelihood of a player achieving the outcome they did against other players in the lobby. So it is looking at the skill level of other players as well. And if it puts you against good players, expecting you to not perform super well, and then you do perform super well, that's going to have a much bigger impact as if you had the same performance against lower skill players where they expected you to do well. And that's really not surprising at all. That makes total sense when it comes to determining a skill rating in a game. But then another thing they confirmed here, which many people were confused about, I've kind of already known this or at least suspected this, and I'm not surprised to see it, but player progression or total time spent playing the game, these are not factored into skill at all. So a person's level in the game or the amount of time played they have in the game, that has nothing to do with their skill rating. You could be the max rank, but a not very good player, and your skill rating will reflect the fact that you're not a very good player. Next up, let's talk about skill rating changing over time. And this is one of the areas I do have an issue with based on my experiences with this system. So with this, they mentioned that players' skill rating may vary because somebody's experimenting with a new loadout, or they haven't played recently, or they're simply tired or distracted. And that second point there, with players that haven't played recently, I believe this is effectively confirming there is an MMR decay. So if you take time off from the game, and this is something I've noticed many times over the years, if you take a week or 2 off and then you come back to the game, typically your first match or 2 are going to be extremely easy. And then after that, it will adjust your skill rating and then you'll be back to your normal lobbies. They go on to say that it's important that a player's skill value is updated on an ongoing basis and that it will reach equilibrium quickly. So they're trying to make very quick adjustments here. If you're overperforming, they want to make a quick adjustment to make sure that you're matched at a level that matches your recent performance. And this is something that the data has continually showed with the SBMM tests we've done since Modern Warfare 2019. This matchmaking system doesn't really appear to care much about your career performance, your overall performance. Instead, it's almost entirely based on your recent performance, how well you've done in your most recent matches. And the problem with that they do acknowledge here is overcorrection can lead to large fluctuations in the skill of players that somebody's matched with and against, and it can lead to unfair matches. But then they say, however, when a player's abilities are stable, it's equally important that skill calculations find the stable midpoint quickly. And this entire style of system where it's adjusting rapidly based on your recent performance, this is one of the big issues I have with the current matchmaking system. In my experience, this has a huge negative impact on variety and experimentation, which they actually acknowledge early on in this as well. They say that your performance may vary if you're experimenting with a new loadout. And the problem with this is, let's just say that you have been using your favorite setups and you've been playing really well for your past several games, and therefore your current skill rating is quite high for your abilities. Well, when you do want to take a bit of a break from that and you want to try something different, use some variety, maybe use a really off-meta loadout, or you want to complete a weird challenge or something, well, when you get into your next match, the system is placing you on that match with the assumption that you're going to continue performing how you've been recently performing. And therefore, when you pull out that really weird off-meta loadout, you're likely going to get absolutely stomped in that match and have a horrible experience, which sure, for the match after that, it will then adjust and drop your skill rating down so it'll be a more appropriate level. But that effectively means you have to just suck it up for that game, take the massive hit, get absolutely stomped on, in order for the system to then adjust your skill rating and place you into a lobby where you are able to perform okay with that off-meta setup. And I think many people have started to notice this pattern, whether consciously or subconsciously, and they realize if I want to be able to keep up in a match, I have to stick to my meta loadout, because if I don't, if I try branching out, I'm going to have a horrible game and it's going to really suck for me, because the matchmaking system is assuming that I'm going to be using my meta loadout in that game. And therefore, I should be able to compete with those players with a meta loadout, but I can't with an off-meta loadout. So therefore, I'm just not going to branch out. I know how that goes when I try that, and it's not a fun experience, and therefore, I'm going to be less likely to try to branch out and use variety in the game. So in my eyes, at least, it seems like it would be much more appropriate to take an average of your skill rating over a longer period of time. And that way, if you are somebody that sometimes uses meta weapons, sometimes goes off meta or does some weird challenges, you'll see that reflected in your averages over time. And therefore, when you want to switch back and forth between those, you're not going to be seeing as wild of swings and as much of a stomping when you decide to suddenly go off meta. And not only that, for those players that are on the lower end of the spectrum and they are trying to improve, when they finally get that really good match or two and they start to get on a roll, their skill rating updates, and now it's starting to expect that performance out of them, which can then be really demoralizing, because suddenly you get bumped up into a bracket that you now can't compete with, and it almost feels like a punishment because you performed well recently due to how quickly this can swing from one game to the next. Whereas again, if this were an average over a longer period of time, there would be a much smoother transition here that I think would make way more sense. In either case, let's move on to the next main point I wanted to talk about here, and this is a feedback loop that they described if you don't have skill-based matchmaking present. And this is one of the reasons that I'm actually in favor of some form of loose skill-based matchmaking. Essentially, what they mention here is if the low-skill players engage less with the titles, which they tend to do with no skill-based matchmaking present, well, they're going to be playing less, and therefore the next bracket up from them, they become the new low-skill players in the game, which will then cause them to end up playing less, and then the next skill level of players, they're now the lowest skill players, and that's just a continual loop that goes until all you're left with are really good players playing the game, and at that point, it's impossible to attract new players because they just get absolutely annihilated the moment they try out the game. And like I said, I think this is actually a good point as to why it is important to have at least some form of skill matching in order to protect those lowest of low skill players, so you can at least minimize the impact that this feedback loop will have. Now, at the same time, I think it is important to consider the other end of the spectrum, and you don't want to go too harsh with the matchmaking, otherwise you end up punishing players for improving, and you end up punishing the best and typically most dedicated of your player base. And that's why I always say that I'm in favor of fairly loose skill-based matchmaking. In either case, let's move on to a couple really interesting graphs that they shared for us, showing some results from their tests that they've done, where with the first test, they reduced skill-based matchmaking for a cohort of players, and then they compared it to the players where they didn't reduce skill-based matchmaking. And this is showing the difference in percentage of players returning within 14 days of playing with this reduced SBMM. And as expected here, on the left-hand side, with the lower skill range players, there was a small uptick in players not returning to the game within 14 days after playing with that reduced SBMM, again, compared to the group where they didn't reduce that SBMM. Although it is worth noting, at worst, this was a 1.75% difference between the two groups. And that's for that second skill bucket. Whereas out of all of this, only the top 10% of players saw an improvement to this value, where when the SBMM was reduced, they were less likely to be leaving the game within 14 days compared to the other group with the standard matchmaking. And of course, this isn't surprising. When players are used to a certain level of matchmaking, you reduce that matchmaking, the lower skill players are suddenly going to be performing worse than they were previously, the higher skill players are going to be performing better than they did previously, and therefore these results obviously reflect that. Additionally, with these tests, they also showed quit rates, so how often people were quitting matches between the two groups. When SBMM is reduced, it's less likely that good players will be quitting the match, and more likely that less skilled players will be quitting the match. Now, they also mentioned here they tried testing on the opposite end as well, where they cranked SBMM up higher than normal and did some tests with that. But unfortunately, they didn't share the exact data with us. We didn't actually get to see the graphs of that. They just mentioned that it had an inverse effect, which obviously isn't surprising, but I would have liked to see the actual values attached to that to see how much of an inverse effect it had. Next, let's skip ahead to something that I found interesting. They also tried a matchmaking system out at one point that protected only the bottom 25% of players and allowed for looser matchmaking for the remaining 75% of players, which is something many of us in the community have suggested. And I think that makes a lot of sense, where you're protecting the lower skilled players while everybody else is just fighting it out in the regular matchmaking, or somewhat regular matchmaking with looser matchmaking parameters. And they just mentioned this had clear negative effects on player counts in 2 weeks with increased quit rates and reductions in total hours played. And that is unfortunate to see. This is one of those areas though where I wish they would be sharing data on this. It seems like they always love sharing graphs and data when it shows positive impacts, and it seems like they just like making mention of things that had negative impacts without giving us the data on that, so we can't really analyze that for ourselves. Next up, let's talk a little bit about team balancing. One note that they had in here that's nice to see some clarification on is when you're playing in a party, it does appear to create an average skill rating in order to matchmake. And it's great to see clarification on that. There's been a lot of confusion with this. A lot of people claim that it always takes the highest skill player. It takes their skill rating when matchmaking. Other people said it's like the party host. So if you have a low skill player host the party and then search for a game, you're going to get that low skill player's lobbies. But instead, it looks like they aim for an average with that party when matchmaking. And another thing on team balance I initially skipped over, but I went back and screenshotted this. They mentioned the goal with team balancing is to make the outcome of a match as unpredictable as possible. And they shared this graph here as well, and it appears what they're trying to aim for is a roughly 50% chance of winning for both teams. And in order to accomplish that, they want the average team skill differential, so the average skill rating of both teams, to be as close to 0 as possible. Now on paper, this sounds like a good idea to prevent blowouts, and I definitely think that some form of team balancing is obviously important. You don't want every match to be a huge blowout. But at the same time, there are issues with this, and these are issues that I actually experience in game, and them showing this to me actually validates what I've been thinking the whole time. If you enter matchmaking as a solo player, and you're a top percentile player, so it's highly unlikely that anyone in a random lobby is going to be at your level, simply because there aren't many players out there that are at that level, especially players that are currently searching for that exact mode at that exact time. What tends to happen with the team balancing here is in order to get that team skill differential as close to 0 as possible, it has to give you all of the worst players on your team. And that means while you still personally might be better than everyone else on the other team, the entire weight of that match falls on your shoulders. And especially if you've been performing well recently, the matchmaking system is expecting you to continue to perform at that level, and therefore you have to give it your all just in order to get a 50% chance of winning that game. And what I very frequently see when playing solo is I will be the only one positive on my team. Everyone else on my team is getting absolutely annihilated, but I will be able to perform just fine as long as I'm using meta weapons, and I can outperform every player in the lobby from both teams by a large margin and still pretty consistently lose games. And I don't find that to be very satisfying as the good player that feels the need to hard carry that match where the entire weight of that match falls on my shoulders. But also thinking about the players on my team, since they have to be the worst players matched up with me to get that team skill differential as close to 0 as possible, that means everybody on the other team is going to be way better than them, and they're just getting stomped on. So that can't be fun for the worst player in the game as well to be matched up like that. Now, I realize team balancing can also be a challenging thing when we're talking about parties. As soon as you mix parties into the equation, that throws things off, and that leads to a lot more stomping. But the ironic thing here is because it feels so punishing to play as a good solo player without a party, now I'm more likely to play with a party, and therefore I'm more likely to absolutely stomp on matches and create a horrible experience for players on the other team because they can rarely effectively balance those teams out. So like I said, I think some level of team balancing is important, but trying to aim for that 50% win rate every time and trying to get as close to that as possible, I think that can also have negative effects. And also that brings up the question, Is it such a horrible thing that the best player in the lobby by far has a better than 50% chance of winning in that match? To me, it seems like that person has earned the potential to win more than 50% of their matches. What's the point of trying to get really good at the game if you're still just getting 50% win rate every time you play solo? But next up, they went into a lot of depth about player matching, and honestly, a lot of this stuff was really confusing. But they did mention a few parameters they use and how they combine skill with player geolocation. So with a search, they start this off with the player geolocation, so where you're actually located. Then they add your skill rating as an additional dimension, and there's a multiplier that they combine with your geolocation for a search. Then after that, they take a look at your control scheme, so controller or mouse and keyboard, and then they add all of that together to perform matchmaking. And this seems to contradict at least the impression that they were giving off with one of the previous white papers, where they continually mention ping is king, and it is the #1 thing in search priority. While it's still technically #1 here, your geolocation, they also mention that they're combining that with your skill rating. And this seems to directly contradict the idea that ping is king, or at least what many people's definition of ping is king is. I guess you could still argue ping is still at the top of the list there. Your geolocation is more important than your skill rating, but now they're saying that they combine those two values to create a weighted value. And they do point out a little later as well that in the previous white paper of matchmaking series, when they were discussing the role of ping, they stated that skill level has no impact on the latency experience. And now they're saying this was an oversimplification and should be clarified. Skill level has a small impact on matchmaking outcomes, including delta ping and search time. But then they said this is minor and not strictly linear, and then they showed a couple graphs here. The first one showing search time, where if you're a really low skill player, apparently your search time is going to be fastest, whereas higher skill players, it's generally going to take longer. Although it is worth noting at the 70th percentile, this appears to be where you have the peak search time. And then with their absolute ping values, they shared a graph here that shows that on average, the higher your skill rating, the lower your ping is. Although again, the differences here weren't major by any means. And I've got to say, when it comes to this, I do believe that they aren't lying with this. They are providing real values, real numbers that they've tested. But I've got to say, this doesn't align with my experience at all. Now, I realize I don't live like right next to a data center, but with my experience in Modern Warfare 3, especially lately, what I've noticed is it is extremely rare to ever see my best possible ping, which is to the Seattle server, and my ping will be roughly 20 milliseconds at that point. Whereas my second best ping value, which is about 45 to 50 milliseconds, so more than double my best ping, this is what I tend to see more often than not. And then I very frequently, unfortunately, see my third or fourth best ping value at 70 milliseconds or more. And keep in mind, this is when playing popular game modes. I'm not playing some game mode that doesn't have a big player base. This is like the small map mosh pit or regular domination, for instance. And in these papers, they can explain ping is king all they want, but I do have a very hard time relating to the data that they're sharing here and seeing how inconsistent my ping value is while playing Call of Duty, and knowing that there's a likelihood that my skill level is preventing me from seeing a better possible connection. That does create a lot of frustration. And anecdotally, it really doesn't feel like ping is king by any means. And there we go. That wraps it up for the main points that I wanted to pull out of this white paper. And I've got to say, overall, it looks like SBMM is absolutely not going anywhere. I didn't expect that to be the case, but with these white papers, it's basically them just explaining, we know better than you, we have the data to show it, which of course they do, but it doesn't make it any less frustrating for those of us that are negatively impacted by this system. And this leads me to some of my final thoughts and points here. One big thing I wanted to bring up here is apparently, according to their metrics, their matchmaking system seems to have a massive impact on the experience players are having with the game, as evidenced by the SBMM testing that they did and the data that they shared there. And if it's having such a drastic impact on a player's experience, that must mean that there is a drastic difference in those lobbies between different players of different skill levels. And if we're effectively playing at a different difficulty level in the game, depending on where we stand skill-wise, then at the very least, they should be displaying what that skill level is that we're playing. Are we playing the game on easy mode, medium mode, hard mode, somewhere in between? Where do we stand? How do we stack up against other players? This is something I've asked for quite a few years now, and I'm going to keep pushing for it. If you're going to have a different experience with the game, depending on your skill level, at least let us see what our skill level is. I know ideally that's best suited to a ranked play system, but obviously this matchmaking system isn't going anywhere in pubs. So the next best thing I could hope for here is at least let us see what our skill rating is, and let us compare that to the average. Let us compare that to other players out there. As it is right now, all of that is hidden and everybody's playing at a different difficulty level in the game. Additionally, I've said it before many times, but I'll say it again pretty much every time skill-based matchmaking comes up in a video. The fact that lobbies disband after every match is still one of my biggest issues, and most of my complaints with this matchmaking system would be either significantly reduced or in some cases disappear entirely. Because with persistent lobbies, not only can you form friendships and rivalries over multiple games, you also have a story that takes place over multiple games and throughout an entire gameplay session. That's something we used to have with Call of Duty, and that's been taken away from us. And with persistent lobbies, there's no wild swings from one match to the next. And this means I can judge the performance of the lobby and make decisions about variety accordingly. If I find myself in an easy lobby, the next game I'm going to be much more likely to feel comfortable messing around with a weird setup or trying to complete a really difficult challenge. Whereas if I find myself in a hard lobby, now I know it's going to be a difficult fight, I can stick to my meta setups, and I can have rematches with those game after game, which can be really satisfying in those tough fought lobbies. I personally love that back and forth game after game. And then to top all of that off, persistent lobbies means ping consistency. If I get into a lobby with a good ping, I can stay in that lobby and maintain that good ping rather than have to roll the dice every single time I get into a game and sometimes have triple the ping I had the previous game. So there we go. I know I repeat myself a lot when it comes to that, but I do feel very strongly about this particular topic. And this is where I'm curious to hear from you guys in those comments down below. How do you feel about this white paper they added today, talking about how they integrate skill into the equation with matchmaking? If you enjoyed this one, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.